In last week's episode, we talked about Metal Gear Solid and the idea that language is a virus. Let's see what you had to say. Okay, so first things first, you might notice that this is neither my apartment nor the Idea Channel wall. This is actually the same space that the Idea Channel wall was in, but we're moving studios. So the stuff moved before we did, so we kind of so that's why it looks weird. This is what has been behind the Idea Channel set for about a year. I mean, not actually. I mean, Applebox Owen Wilson is here a special just for this right now. It's not like we had him trapped back there. Okay, on to comments. So this week in Rugnetta's Law, both Pontypool and Snow Crash, they are a great movie and a great book, respectively, that approach a lot of the ideas that we talked about in last week's episode that we didn't mention. You know, I wish we could mention all of the things that relate to all of the other things. But, you know, the gray goo of ideas, you gotta resist it. But yeah, if you haven't seen or watched or read those things, recommended. One thing that happened in the comments that I was surprised by, though probably shouldn't have been, was a lot of people sharing stories about either no longer using and then forgetting their first language, or how their first language or their understanding of it or their even understanding of the world changed after learning a second language. And so many of these stories are so interesting, and the story that lyadmilo shares is really great, and there's a good conversation that follows it. So, I mean, if you haven't, I would highly recommend just going back to the video and scrolling through and just seeing people talk about their experience of either forgetting a language or learning a new one and how it changes their perceptions of the world, because it's crazy interesting. So links to lyadmilo's comment and all these other ones in the doobly-doo. Such a lust for comments! Ooh! Kevin S. points out, and I didn't go and fact check this, I'm realizing now, so I guess, Kevin, I'm taking your word on this, that Metal Gear Solid 5, or Metal Gear Solid V, as I have been told is what it should actually be called, was the first Metal Gear game to be recorded in English before it was recorded in Japanese. And this makes me wonder whether or not this was a decision that Kojima made or one that Konami made. Because I would guess that there is maybe some economic reason for having English be the sort of the central localization and then branching out from there. But yeah, this sort of, to me, poses more questions about Kojima's attitude towards English than it does answers. MakiPcr points out the kind of cultural hegemony of English through a comic book culture, that, you know, comic books as an export of English-speaking nations sort of requires one to abandon, if even momentarily, their own native language so that they can involve themselves in a progressively globalized culture. And I think, yeah, like this relates very much to an idea that we talked about in the episode about whether or not popular culture needs to be popular. There's an idea that pop culture is in some way American culture because American culture has that kind of hegemonic role across all of popular culture the world over. And then they also go on to talk about the sort of difficulty and almost sadness that can arise when languages die out, because you lose that perspective and that subjectivity of the world. And I think this is, you know, there are great books about what happens when language dies and why that is such a thing that could be lamented, because, you know, you lose just these, like we talked about in last week's episode, you lose these subjectivities, like what Dorothy Lee was talking about. But yeah, I agree. Kyle Kallgren, who is awesome and whose videos you should definitely watch if you don't, makes a really great point about how we can also have languages within languages. That, you know, what Skullface is talking about is not necessarily English as a whole, but maybe a group of people who use it, and that there are ways to deploy a language that can communicate certain values or can communicate and reinforce certain ideologies, and that's all about the speaker and not necessarily about the language itself. And I think that this gets back to this, one of the ideas that we touched upon, which is that it's not necessarily the language so much as it's the people who use it, the markets that require the use of that language, the sort of the way that it is both structured and structures culture and media and stuff like that. That it's not necessarily just the thing so much as it's as Kyle talks about Wittgenstein, the games that we play with it. Relatedly, Chad Deffler talks about how certain languages can make certain areas of study easier to approach, and mentions both Latin and German as they relate to philosophy, that these are languages which make the practice of philosophy a little bit easier, and if you don't have a sort of fluent understanding of them, that you are at a disadvantage for the complicated ideas contained therein. And this makes me think about something that Chad mentions really briefly, which is the sort of this idea that English is the language of science. It seems to be that, for better or worse, the global science community has settled on English as its language. The thing that I wonder is whether or not this is a kind of chicken and the egg problem, because I can see how it might be possible that it's not just that the language of a country makes those pursuits easier, but that the culture within that country views those pursuits as symbolic of something that they value. In reality, it may be that there's a kind of, mutual constitution that happens where French might make certain kinds of theory easier to understand or easier to work with, but it's also that France, as a country and a culture, has long supported the practice of theory because it represents something greater. And I think that you could maybe also say the same thing about, English, science, and the pursuit of rationalism or objectivity or understanding. But yeah, this, I'm realizing, is maybe just an Idea Channel episode later. Etienne, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone else. It's been an awesome 2015. Thank you for all of your awesome comments, for all of your great thoughts, for, talking on Twitter and for hanging out in the various places that we have been. Someone asked me recently whether or not we were planning on doing more office hours in 2016, and the answer to that is yes. I'm sorry that, sort of life and travel got crazy for the last part of 2015 when we were gonna do a second one, but I want to hang out. I want to see everybody again. But yeah, hey, you guys you're just so cool, and I like you a lot. Yeah, that's just there's no joke here. That's just actually true. Caitlin, this is really interesting and hits on something that I have noticed and have wondered about, but have not ever had explained to me, which is that. So I have a bunch of friends who speak Japanese. I don't speak Japanese. I don't even know word number one, but they tend to greet people, say thank you in Japanese, which your comment sort of indicates why, that it is that you have these things where you want to express a certain kind of feeling, but there are certain languages that do it better than others. And it just never occurred to me that Japanese as a language may be very polite and is just very, very good at expressing politeness, which kind of blows my mind. And it makes me wonder what all of those sort of thank yous and goodbyes and hellos actually literally translate to in English, if there is even a literal translation. But yeah, this, much like Schadenfreude, sort of shined a little spotlight on my brain. So thank you for writing this. As far as symbols of the empire go, hamburgers are pretty good. A victory of capitalism.